All right, today we will talk about lust. So, just as God has willed to attach sense pleasure to eating to help our self-preservation, so he has attached a special pleasure to those things which pertain to the propagation of the human species. So that's why there is pleasure attached to both of those things. First, in order that the individual continue to exist, and secondly, that the species continue to exist. That's the only reason for it. All right, so it should not be in some way extolled beyond that. If eating were not a pleasure, you would never do it. You would just die. So think of things that are put on the table that you can't stand. I don't know if that's true around here, but in other words, if somebody, like when I was in France, I was given oysters to eat. All right, so that was, if we were on a steady diet of oysters, I would starve to death because there's no pleasure involved in it. It's actually disgust. So, that pleasure is there for a reason. Pleasure can never be sought for its own sake. That's a general moral principle. It has to be sought in conjunction with that to which it is attached, because there is always an action that is attached to pleasure, or I should say it's the other. Pleasure is always attached to an action. So in order for the pleasure to be in accordance with the moral law, the action must be in accordance with the moral law. So that's why gluttony is a sin, because you are eating for pleasure only beyond the morality of the act. It's right to sit down at the table and eat and drink, all right? But if you eat and drink too much, especially alcohol, then gluttony becomes involved. So you are actually harming your health by eating too much. And therefore there's an immorality there. And the reason you're doing that is to have the pleasure beyond the morality of the act. So you're acting for pleasure there. So another bottle of wine. So with regard to propagation of the species, the pleasure of sex is permissible for married people because children should be begotten in the state of matrimony. We are not like animals. We don't merely reproduce and let them loose after a few weeks. The human being is a rational creature and also a religious creature, and he must be therefore educated. That is, not merely given information in a school, but he must be brought up. He must be mortified in his passions, and he must learn discipline, etc., and primarily the faith. So there is that's why you're at home for years before they let you loose. And because of that moral training, most of all, the moral training. So that's why it is only permissible in marriage. Therefore, any use of sexual activity or sexual pleasure outside of marriage is a mortal sin in itself. In other words, it is grave matter. Because the reason is that procreation is exactly what it sounds like. It is cooperating with God in the creation of a human being. So therefore, all of the acts that pertain to procreation are very serious. See, it's not just like animals reproducing or plants reproducing. It is it is a cooperation with God in the production of an immortal soul and a person with an immortal soul. So it's extremely serious. So there is a tendency, however, to engage in these pleasures outside of wedlock. And this tendency is known as the vice of lust. It is one of the 7 capital sins. Remember that the 7 capital sins are roots of sins. Right? They are not only sins in themselves, but they are roots of sins. That is, they produce other sins. They are vices from which other sins grow. And it's one of the 7 capital sins. So this vice of lust concerns not only exterior actions, but interior ones as well. So all impure actions with ourselves or with others are forbidden, and it's grave matter. That means the only way it could be venial is by what we call imperfection of the act, where there is not a sufficient reflection or sufficient consent. In other words, imperfect consent or without sufficient reflection. It's known as the imperfection of the act. But there's 3 ingredients to mortal sin. One is that the matter must be grave. Secondly, that there must be full consent of the will. Thirdly, there must be sufficient reflection. So things that are done quickly and without thought cannot qualify for mortal sin, even though the matter is grave. Or if there is not complete consent of the will, but only partial consent, that also disqualifies from mortal sin. Now that you'll learn in moral theology, but because it's important in the confessional to distinguish all of those things. You have to be a judge as to what exactly was committed and the gravity of what was committed. It's an art, actually, and you have to know all of the principles. That's why you study moral theology for a long time. Take 4 years of moral theology. And you have to be on your toes in the confessional, because you're getting all of this information and you have to judge it. And then you also need to ask the proper questions to determine what the guilt is and so forth. And you have to, all of your moral theology will come together in those few minutes in the confessional. It's not an easy thing. It's a draining thing to hear confessions, because you have all of those thoughts going on in your head as far as how to, what principles to apply. And how to read your penitent. And half the time the penitent does not give you enough information. So you have to constantly improve the confession by asking questions. The typical child will come in and say, I was bad. And everyone, it's very common to hear, I had impure thoughts. My response to that is that saints have impure thoughts, okay? Great saints have impure thoughts. Did you consent to the impure thoughts? But to merely have them is not a sin. That they come to your mind is not a sin. You must be complacent with them. All right, so you have to, and then you find out, well, no, I said prayers when when they came, and so that's just part of, you'll see. So, but very typically people come in with sloppy confessions. That's why the easiest confessions to hear are those of priests, because they know what they should be confessing and how to confess it. So, so all thoughts, fantasies, or desires are forbidden, which are not in the limits of the state of marriage. All right, and you'll learn more about that as you go into moral theology. These interior acts of impurity are the prelude to the exterior act. And there is no exterior act of impurity which can take place unless there has been an interior complacency. So the real battlefield of lust is in your head. If you win the battle in your mind, you'll win the whole battle. But after you have conceded the battlefield in your head, everything else will follow. Now, what is the gravity of sins against purity? When one seeks and directly wills the evil pleasure, it is always a mortal sin. So full consent and direct will. The reason is that the propagation of the human species and the actions which contribute to the procreation of children are serious matter, which I said. Thus, if one could seek these pleasures outside of their intended ends, then the plan and purpose of the Creator would be frustrated. They would have no sense or purpose outside of that end. On the other hand, the performance of actions which give rise to this pleasure, if these actions are good and useful in themselves, or at least indifferent, does not constitute a mortal sin as long as there is no consent to the pleasure. So, doctors and nurses must examine and take care of persons of the opposite sex. So they have a serious reason in order to put themselves in the occasion of sin. And they must take the proper precautions. Now, doctors will tell you that for some reason or other, there is no problem with that. In other words, that there's no lust involved in examining people of the opposite sex. It's just a different, you're just a patient, that's all. So it's not something really to worry about. But that's the principle. In other words, if you put yourself deliberately in an occasion of grave sin without a serious reason, that is itself a grave sin, even if you don't actually sin. But to put yourself without a sufficient reason in the occasion of a grave sin, that is where you are likely to consent, then that is itself a sin. But if you have a sufficient reason and you have taken the proper precautions to avoid the sin, such as prayer, such as mortification, etc., then it is not sinful. See, and it's all by proportion. So there's a very great proportion between, examining somebody who's sick, and the occasion. See, that's a big proportion. That outweighs the occasion. So you have a sufficient reason there. So that's true too. And police officers in their course of duty might see members of the opposite sex in various states of undress, but they have to perform their duty. The study of moral theology is considered to be an occasion of sin. Wait until you get to the 6th and 9th commandment and the sins of married people. All right? That's considered to be a necessary occasion of sin. Hearing confessions is a necessary occasion of sin, because people will tell you things that you would rather not think about. They will tell you things that you have never even thought were possible. Okay. So that's a necessary occasion of sin, but you must take the proper precautions. As long as you do not consent to whatever pleasure you may experience, then there is no sin. So you can experience pleasure, but do not consent to it. Very important point. In other words, merely to experience pleasure is not to consent to it. Consent to it is to rejoice in it, to welcome it, to be complacent in it. So these are all moral principles, but they're important for you because the most common way in which mortal sin is committed is through lust. It's not the worst of the mortal sins. It's actually among the least, because it's a sin of weakness, whereas other sins are sins of malice. Sins of injustice, for example, are sins of malice, and as I recently said, I think, in a newsletter, sins of justice or of injustice are almost always premeditated. You have to think about it. You have to think about robbing a bank. You don't walk into a bank and think, why don't you give me all your money? You have to think about it. If you're going to cheat somebody, or it's premeditated. And justice actually is a higher virtue than purity. So sins against justice are premeditated and in themselves worse. And I say in themselves. Many times sins of injustice are venial by lightness of matter. So if you steal somebody's pencil, that's not a mortal sin. It's a sin of injustice, but it's not a mortal sin. But if you embezzle $1 million from the bank, that's a mortal sin. Sins against charity are in themselves worse than sins of lust. And many times people are more conscious of their sins of lust than they are of their sins of injustice and their sins of lack of charity. And the reason for that is, as St. Thomas Aquinas says, that lust makes us like animals. So we have a shame about lust. And the shame should not be confused with the actual morality of it. There's a feeling of shame about it. And the shame comes from the fact that we've acted like animals. So, yes?
Sorry, so do the properly married Catholics who do it properly, the marriage act, also feel that shame?
Well, not in that sense, but there is, and theologians speculate, there is a certain shame about it. And the speculation is that is how original sin is communicated, even in marriage. That's how original sin gets spread. And that's why there is a shame. I mean, Adam and Eve had to cover themselves. There was a shame. They were married, but they covered themselves because there is something about it that has taken on a shame. It's there. I mean, whatever you want to say about it, however you want to speculate about it, but there is a certain shame about it. So if, on the other hand, the actions which we perform are neither good, useful, or necessary, such as bad books, shows, conversations, lewd dancing, movies, etc., pornography on the internet, they are sinful, either venially or mortally, depending on the extent of their disorder and the danger of consent to the evil pleasure. So, to see something that is slightly immodest in a movie is not a mortal sin. Practically every movie has something slightly immodest. That's not a mortal sin. That doesn't mean it's good or anything like that. But again, you could say, because let's say the entertainment is of at least a certain value to you, you could tolerate that occasion of sin, assuming that it's not a serious occasion of sin, because it's light. See, that's the morality of it. That if you have some good reason to be there, and that would be a light reason that would justify the light occasion of sin. So it could be internet, it could be you have a reason to be on the internet. Sometimes things pop up on the internet which are disgusting, and you have to take the means to avoid those things. But you have a reason to be on the internet, in many cases a serious reason. Serious does not mean it has to be overpowering or grave. The Latin word gravis comes over as grave in English, and that's not the same. Grave means really, 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 really serious, and that's not the sense. It just has to be a serious reason, a good reason. See, so you shouldn't. That word grave in English is beyond the Latin word gravis. Gravis means that it has a foundation. It's not some stupid reason. Now, the effects of lust. This is where lust has a greater hold, you might say, than other sins. If you tell someone to stop robbing banks, okay, I'll stop robbing banks. You see, he can deal with that a little bit more easily. But lust is something that is a constant temptation, even from nature. So it can come from nature or the devil. But nature is a strong inclination to it. So it's just, it's always there. So that's the problem. The bank robber can give up bank robbing because he doesn't have that in his nature to do that. It's not a constant temptation from nature. So that's true of sins of weakness, that they like for example, gambling. People who are addicted to gambling, they have a thrill. They're not so much interested in the money as the thrill of the next move. And they get addicted to that thrill. And that's very hard for them to get rid of it. So the first effect of lust is the formation of strong habits of sin. So people who are addicted to lust and who do not overcome sins of lust by prayer and mortification fall into virtually constant mortal sin. Serious habits of mortal sin. So it has a grip on you. So the pleasure of lust is so intense and the inclination is so strong that young people easily fall into habits of impure thoughts and impure actions. So it is a devastating vice in that sense. And then they lose sight of spiritual things. They become dissipated in the sense that they just live for pleasure. And these habits establish a tyranny in the soul. And those who have these habits become the slaves of impurity. When the habit of impurity has overtaken the soul, any relish for prayer disappears. So it's a prayer killer. So it's very lethal in that sense. It's not just a sin. It has terrible effects. St. Thomas says, nothing blinds us more to the things of God than impurity. Love of any austere virtue goes away. The soul becomes incapable of self-sacrifice and unselfish motives. So a person who is addicted to impurity becomes a selfish monster. And many times marriages are based on this impurity. And that's extremely dangerous. The appetite for impurity is essentially a selfish appetite. Or I should say that the appetite for sex in general is a selfish appetite, just like your food appetite is selfish. You want to eat that food. You want to consume it. You want it for yourself. See, so also that appetite for the pleasure of sex is a selfish appetite. It is not love. Oh, it's love. It's self-love. And it has its legitimate outlets, but it's self-love. And so people that go into a marriage with these habits of mortal sin and these repeated acts of self-love, I mean, they're doomed practically. And the problem is that they think that's love. They think that this very, very strong attachment to the flesh of the other person is love. It is not. It is self-love. But, it is all-consuming and it's blinding. It's what causes love sickness. That I'm going to jump off a cliff because I've broken up with my girlfriend, even though you never knew her for 20 years. But now you can't go on without her. That's all driven by, and also all of the murders that take place because of lust. If I can't have you, no one else will have you. See, so if there's adultery, very commonly the other spouse will shoot or poison or do something awful to the adulterating spouse, because if I cannot have you, notice that, no one else will have you. It's like a dog. See, it's self-love, but that's the reason why they kill those spouses. It's very commonly the cause of murder. Jealousy. See, jealousy is that somebody has something that really belongs to you. You see that self-love in it? See, it's a general principle that material things can only be enjoyed by one person. That's why you own things. Whereas spiritual things can be enjoyed by many people totally. So everyone enjoys the same symphony as they're sitting in the concert hall. Totally. But not everyone can have the same piece of cake. See, so that idea of my spouse belongs to me, which is true in a sense, but it's based on that self-love, that the spouses belong to each other for a very utilitarian reason. That's why it's against justice. Adultery is not merely impurity, it's against justice, because you owe that fidelity. See, if a person truly loved his or her spouse and that spouse were unfaithful, he or she would say nothing and just bear it. But very typically, because and I'm telling you this in order to understand what lust is. It's an appetite, a very strong appetite to draw someone to yourself, basically, to have someone. And so you should never extol it as something beyond that. And the reason for that is that you'll go out and get a wife and have children so that the human race goes on. That's the reason for it. Otherwise, it wouldn't be there. There's no other reason for it. And that's why in many cases, it's not uncommon that people divorce when they're in their 60s because they're just not interested in each other anymore. They're not fighting. They're just not interested anymore. So that's an important thing to understand about it. So when you have these habits, all that counts is the pursuit of lust and the attainment of pleasure. So people live for that. So often if you tell people You're in an invalid marriage. And you must act as brother and sister. Very often no, because they're so attached. That happens a lot. A lot of people walk away from the traditional Mass because we tell them we don't recognize Novus Ordo annulments. And they're so attached that they're incapable of doing what's right. So they end up loving flesh more than God. It's serious, because they know now. See, in the Novus Ordo, they have the annulment, they think we're okay, we don't have a problem. Then they come, they understand the problem. They don't object to what you're saying. Many times they have, most of the time, they have annulments for bogus reasons. I would say 98% of the time. You'll do in moral theology reasons for invalidating marriages, and they are very few and they are very rare in occurrence. But now they're giving them out. And basically, if you don't get along, they'll find a reason why the marriage was invalid. That's essentially it. So that's why we can't even think about them. But that happens a lot because they're so attached. Men become soft interiorly and incapable of courage and uprightness. So impurity softens men, you might say. It makes them mush. That's why St. Paul's word for masturbation is molities. Softness. That's in sacred scripture, molities. That was the term for it. Women, on the other hand, lose their sweetness and innocence. So you see, they become hardened. You can see it on their faces, usually, in their personalities. They become hardened people. Tough. They are no longer demure, but make themselves up and dress in a shameless way in order to snare a boyfriend. So all of the impure and immodest dress. You can tell right away. Many times the way a woman wears her hair, you can tell. I mean, you shouldn't go around thinking, well, she wears her hair this way, therefore she... But there's a whole picture, the makeup, the dress, the hair. You can tell pretty much. Modesty pertains to a woman in a certain special way. And when they're immodest, it is very noticeable. Through the selfishness that accompanies lust, the soul loses interest even in everything it once loved. It is so overtaken by lust. These souls stop loving their parents and friends and know only the pursuit of their lust for satisfaction. So it kills off things that ought to be loved. It totally overtakes the soul. And they become inconstant in their relationships. That's one of the effects of lust, and a sign of lust, is inconstancy in relationships. Going from girlfriend to girlfriend and wife to wife and multiple divorces, and that's sure a sign of lust. But even other relationships. They become inconstant because they're based on this very strong self-love. When they get tired of one pleasure object, they move to another. Just like kids with toys at Christmas time. They play with the toy for a few days and then you can't find it anymore. It's because created things cannot satisfy the depth of the human soul. That's the problem. And so there always has to be something else. You exhaust what it can give, and then you have to look to something else and something better, something higher. St. Augustine is very, very good on that. He says, what's going to make you happy is not something lower than you, but something higher. And every created thing is something lower than you. Furthermore, the interior peace of the soul is destroyed because the pleasures are base pleasures. The soul is perpetually ashamed. There is no interior peace. There's no interior order. There's just shame. It's like a drunkard. He goes and gets drunk every day, and he's ashamed of himself. He's ashamed of his weakness. And this is a deep, dark shame which sets in because lust particularly produces shame, as we said yesterday, which constantly gnaws at the conscience. Constantly bothers the conscience. This shame. And the soul has no peace. And consequently, it must constantly seek distraction in order to pull away from the interior shame. So partying and conversations with people and any kind of distraction, worldly distraction, there is no interior life. You have to constantly get your mind off of the problem. This interior disorder over the long term even takes a toll on a person's mental and even physical health. I wouldn't be surprised if the high rate of suicides among teenagers is because of this. That they are in the depths of impurity. All they know is pornography on the internet and masturbation. And all of these effects take place in their soul. So, you know, if something happens, if there's, you know, they don't get their toys or they break up with their boyfriend or girlfriend, then they go right down. I wouldn't be surprised if that's the cause of it. I mean, those things just didn't happen before, you know, say 50 to 100 years ago. Very, very rarely. When there was a more common decency in life. People were raised more decently. And, you know, you didn't have any of the availability of pornography. And teenagers didn't talk about those things. And they didn't engage in fornication as they do today. I mean, it's just, I don't think I have to tell you as far as, you know, what goes on in the minds of modern teenagers and their activity. But they're fornicating at the age of 12, 13, 14 already. Another effect of lust is that any taste for higher things is lost. The intellect becomes dull and weak because you're so attached to matter. And intellection is abstraction. So matter and abstraction are two things that conflict. So students typically do poorly in school when they are attached to lust. And the only thing they can think of is impurity. Another effect is cold-heartedness. Because lust is a selfish love, as we explained, people become cold-hearted. You might think, oh, that doesn't sound like lust. All of the affection that goes with lust is in order to obtain the object. And so when you become disinterested in the object, you move on to something else. So if a prettier girl goes by, and you will dump the one you're with and go after the prettier girl, even though the one that you're with has been the object of so much love. It's all just selfishness. Because you love those, when it's a lustful love, it's a love of an object for yourself. So if something more interesting comes along, you dump the one and you take the new one. That's why people go through many marriages. And it's cold-hearted. Lust is extremely cold-hearted. That's why men will leave their wives and their families and go after some woman. There was that man out in Colorado who was having an affair, and he had beautiful children, a beautiful wife. He killed them all, and then he cut them up and threw them in a dumpster. I mean, beautiful home, everything beautiful. And that's what he did. Because it's cold. Lust is cold. It's selfish. And this is because lust demands its pleasures with great vehemence. And those who are slaves to it give consideration to nothing else but the pursuit of lust. So nothing else matters. Children, wife, the misery of other people, nothing matters. I just have to have my lust object. It's the cause of divorces and all sorts of ugliness. So they become willing to hurt their mothers, their fathers, their brothers, their sisters, and their close friends, even their spouses of many years, in order to satisfy their lust pleasure. People leave behind little children in order to run away in adultery with a new object of impurity. Another effect of lust is impetuosity in decision-making, suddenness, and lack of prudence in decision-making. The slaves of this vice cannot think out things in a prudent and deliberated manner, but lunge headlong into decisions without reflection and make disastrous choices for themselves and for those who depend on them. So you lose your head with lust. Don't forget, all of these effects come together. The lustful man is also an angry man, incapable of interior self-control and patience. He lashes out at everyone whom he perceives to be in his way. So he has no control over himself. And then vanity takes hold of the soul. You see how devastating this vice is. Vanity takes hold of the soul. Men and women alike become obsessed with their appearance and purposely dress and carry themselves so as to attract the opposite sex. This is especially true today. I mean, women dress as if they're made only for one thing. In comparison to the way they dressed in the past, where, well, for example, I mean, the short skirt never existed before 1918. Not on women. It didn't exist. It's amazing. I mean, when you think about it, in 1917, our Blessed Lady said that women's fashions would become very offensive. The rising of the hemline occurred after World War I. And if you look at, say, women dressed in 1920 versus women dressed in 1910, which is only one decade, it is shocking the way they dressed in the 1920s. All sorts of immodesty. They went wild after World War I, the women. It could have been due to the fact that they were working in factories, working outside of the home and becoming, in a sense, that more independent and more in the world. It could have been, I don't know. But it changed overnight. And that's also when the world embraced socialism after World War I. World War I is when Europe went crazy. Okay. The last vestiges of the sanity of pre-revolution Europe were finished. The 19th century was a mix between pre- and post-revolution Europe. A mix. That was all wiped away with World War I. That was culturally a much more devastating war than World War II. It was the beginning of the modern world. And after that, you had the League of Nations and the whole push for a New World Order and all of that stuff. It all comes from that. Also, all of the Middle East problems came from the Peace of Versailles, where they chopped up the Turkish Empire and gave it to various factions, and they put tribes that hated each other into Iraq and into these various countries. Of course, the British got Iraq, which is the most oil-rich country in that whole area. And they gave Syria to France. They also got Palestine. All right. And Lebanon and Syria went to France. So that all the cause of all of that tension in the Middle East is from Versailles. Actually, historically, the only Treaty of Versailles would concern the Germans. It was the Paris Peace Conference in which Europe was carved up. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was split up, and that was in Paris, actually. It's only the Germans who received their treaty in Versailles, where they were essentially, this is it. If you don't accept it, we're going to go to war again. That's what they said. That was Versailles. So that was 1919. Paris was, also 1919. But that was the Paris Peace Conference in which all of the other treaties were made, where the Tyrol was given to, part of the Tyrol was given to Italy. And all sorts of, and that's where, this has nothing to do with what we're talking about, but I'll just give you this little footnote. That's where Woodrow Wilson, after they have carved up the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the German Empire, so he passed the famous comment, "What is the Sudetenland?" It's very significant because the Sudetenland was full of Germans and they gave it to Czechoslovakia. He didn't know even what it was. And that was the cause, one of the causes of the following war. And Benedict XV said that treaty is just another cause of war. You'll see another war from that treaty. Benedict XV. And that's exactly what happened. So, I don't know why we got on that. Oh, yes, World War I. So the impure eventually obtain a hardened look on their face. You can tell it, especially with women, but also with men. There's a hardened look. Women particularly lose their sweetness when they become impure. There's something sweet about a woman. It's hard to say. Something innocent and virtuous about a woman, and she loses that through impurity. You can tell. Something on her face. It occurs with men too, though. And people become hardened and inconsiderate in their relationships through lust. So it has a devastating effect. When you just list all of the things that happen to you as a result of lust, a vice of lust, it wipes you out. It's devastating. And it is the easiest way in which to go to hell. As I said, it's not the worst of sins. It's not the worst of mortal sins. But it's the easiest of the mortal sins and the most common of mortal sins. And, only God knows, but I would say probably most of the people in hell are there for reasons of impurity. Now, what are the remedies to lust? First, deep convictions proceeding from the faith that impurity is evil and must be avoided at all costs, even death. So that's the first thing, that I must die instead of consenting to impure anything. Thoughts, desires, actions, I must accept death. If you don't have that deep conviction which proceeds from the faith, you will never overcome the vice. We must also be convinced that it is possible to be pure. People get so deep in the vice of lust that they think, I just can't be any other way. This is impossible for me to act in any other way. This is bigger than I am, as they say. That's false. We should remember that we are temples of God and that our bodies are sacred when we are in the state of sanctifying grace. And they cannot be defiled. In other words, it's morally wrong to defile them, just as it would be morally wrong to defile a church. Secondly, we should remember that we are members of the mystical body of Christ, and as such must act as purely as Christ would act. In other words, completely in accordance with the moral law. For there is a chastity that pertains to every state in life. Then the next big thing to do is avoidance of occasions. Sacred Scripture says, "He that loveth danger shall perish in it." This is especially true of lust. So we must learn to flee from any kind of dangerous entertainment, friends, visits, meetings, literature. That includes internet, any kind of dirty things that we might see either or read about in literature or on the internet or anything. And where it is somehow necessary to see these things, as just going out on the street practically, you have to have a proportionate reason, and also you have to make sure that the occasion is remote. See, an approximate occasion is defined as a circumstance in which you will probably commit sin. That's approximate occasion. A remote occasion is one that is in itself conducive to sin, but in which you probably will not sin. So by moral law, you are permitted to frequent occasions of sin as long as you make them remote by prayer and other means, all of the means we talked about here, and that you have a proportionate reason to frequent it. So livelihood or something that pertains to some serious good reason. That's the moral law concerning occasions of sin. It could be any kind of occasion of sin. Could be alcoholism. So if alcoholics should not visit bars where they're likely to commit sin. So that would be what we'd call a near occasion of sin for an alcoholic. So, and he would have no proportionate reason to go into a bar. Unless he were starving but ordinarily he would have no proportionate reason to think of why an alcoholic should go into a bar. Or someone that wastes money in gambling. He should not go to Las Vegas. That's a near occasion of sin. He couldn't possibly resist gambling. That's an addiction, for a lot of people. They even go to therapy for that. They love the thrill of the next roll. It's a thrill. So we must flee from these occasions as if from a poisonous snake. And the typical examples, all of the media, any kind of film, television, internet, all of that media, bars, dirty friends. One of the most, especially in young people, one of the most significant forms of temptation and the downfall of young people is bad friends, bad company. Because young people have a particular attachment to be like their friends. They feel good if they're accepted, and you get over that a little bit when you get older. You couldn't care less, frankly. Then another is mortification through first the avoidance of the occasions, which might involve a mortification. That is, that you might have to give up things that you like that are otherwise legitimate. See, for example, to go to the beach is perfectly legitimate in itself. But if there are people there that are seriously immodestly dressed, then it becomes a near occasion of sin. And you don't have a proportionate reason. I'll just finish this. Custody of the eyes. Mortification of the sense of touch. So, for example, taking long, warm showers or sitting in a hot tub for a long time. That feeds lust, making the sense of touch. Lust is based in touch. And so anything that enhances or makes the sense of touch feel good is related to lust. And therefore anything that denies that or is contrary to touch also has the effect of reducing lust. So very soft beds, um, anything at all that makes touch feel good, the sense of touch feel good. Mortification of the imagination. So not permitting your mind to wander into things where it shouldn't be. Avoidance, then also keeping busy. Idleness is the devil's workshop. That's an old saying. So when you're busy, you can't sin. If you're always doing something that pertains to your state in life, it's impossible to sin. But idleness is very common for, so keeping busy is good. And then prayer, of course. So if you pray fervently, you will overcome the temptation. Fervently and sincerely, you have to really hate the temptation. It shouldn't be that, well, I'll say a few Hail Marys and then give in. So you have to hate it. And that fervent and sincere prayer is a sign that you're not giving consent. So you shouldn't be troubled by a temptation that is very vehement and very long-lasting if you're giving it a vehement response by prayer. Frequent confession and frequent reception of the Holy Eucharist.